Go ahead and update your table of contents. Punnett squares, page 92, and Punnett square output on page 93. Go ahead and label page 92 Punnett squares. Let's start off where we left off from last class. So basically, we were talking about heredity and how this guy named Gregor Mendel studied pea plants, and he came up with all these cool rules for how we can make predictions about traits that will be passed down. So today we're going to go through, there's a visual way to make these predictions. We talked about how alleles are represented, or traits are represented by alleles, these letters that we associate with different traits. The easiest place to start is with an example. So let's use an example of SpongeBob SquarePants. All right, so he is yellow. Now, yellow is a pretty light color, so I'm going to have to assume that yellow is probably recessive. I think that if there's a darker color, it would cover up that color. So let's say that there are some sponges in the SpongeBob or in the SquarePants family that are maybe green. So let's say green color of the sponge is dominant. So therefore, we are going to use the letter capital G to represent that trait or that allele. So then we're going to have yellow is the recessive trait. We're going to use lowercase g. Now we don't use y, and that's because this is just a general rule, not Mrs. Key rule, just how it is done. You always use the letter of the dominant trait to represent the allele. In this case, green, so G. So in our example, let's say SpongeBob gets married. SpongeBob is recessive, which means that he has 2 yellow alleles. It's the only way that's going to show up. If you're confused by that, go back and watch the previous video. But he has 2 lowercase because he is yellow. Let's say he marries a round pants family. So let's call her Susie Round Pants. Susie is green in color, but actually she has a hidden allele, a hidden yellow allele in there. So the best way to figure out what their children could look like is to do what's called a Punnett square. So you are going to, you would draw out a square, divide it. All right, so once you have this drawn out, you basically take, let's say the SpongeBob first. He's the male, so we'll put him right here. We're gonna put his lowercase g and his lowercase g, one on top of each box. And then we're going to say Susie, we're gonna have capital G, lowercase g. And just another kind of rule is the capital letter always goes first. We wouldn't put lowercase g, capital G. So then we are going to kind of use this box to predict where things are going to go. So it's kind of like a multiplication table. You're sort of going to like pull from each side. So in this box, to see what this child might look like, they're going to receive capital G, lowercase g. And this person, one from each, lowercase g, and then this one, capital G, lowercase g, lowercase g, lowercase g. Now, if you're not following, that was one from each direction. So this one's going to be represented in those 2 places. And then this one is going to be pulling from, you don't have to do these arrows in your notes, but so that's kind of the general gist. Each box you're going to pull the allele from straight above it and the allele to the side of it. And so once you go through and do that, you get these wonderful boxes. So I'm actually gonna take those away because it could be confusing. So here you have the results of this Punnett square. So these are the statistics. There's 4 separate genotype combinations that we're looking at here based on these 2 offspring. So we can look at the top 2, and we can see that these 2 will be green in appearance, and these will be yellow in appearance. So these top ones are green, even though they have a yellow allele present, but that is going to be masked by the green color. So just to go over the statistics of this, we usually talk about this in 2 different ratios. So we have the genotype ratio, and the phenotype ratio. Again, genotype being the actual gene allele combinations that are possible, and phenotype being the physical characteristics that are present. So genotype we typically represent with homozygous dominant to heterozygous to homozygous recessive. So if we were to look first at homozygous dominant, there's not a single one. There's no big G present. And then if we looked at heterozygous, one of each, we see that there are 2 offsprings with that, potentially. And homozygous recessive, we see there are 2. So that's the genotype ratio for this Punnett square. The phenotype is represented by dominant to recessive. So in this case, the dominant was green. So we'll start with green. There are 2 that are going to be green and 2 yellow, statistically. All right, so let's use our output as an opportunity to practice some of our Punnett squares. Let's stick with our SpongeBob SquarePants example just because it's kind of fun. And let's, just practice filling them out at first. We'll get to the harder stuff. But let's say we had, let's go with big G, little g, little g. What would their offspring be? So this is going back to the idea that dominant is green, recessive is yellow. Let's do big G, little g, little g, little g. See what that would be. Let's do big G, little g, big G, little g. So both parents are green, but they both carry the recessive trait yellow. Let's go down and let's talk about round versus square. So let's say square is dominant and round is recessive. So I'm going to use the letter S. So big S, little s. Make sure you make it obvious which one's big and little. And big S, big S. So what would the Punnett square be there? And lastly, let's say little s, big S, little s. So what would that answer there be? Stay tuned, I will give you the answers, but I want you to try them out first. Okay, let's go over the answers. So remember, you're going to start with each box, looking at each box and going, okay, I'm going to pull one from each direction. So I'm going to pull one from the top and one from the side. And that's the same with every single one. Every single box, you're going to pull one from the top, one from the side. Now, the only one from the side here, you have to go all the way over to the left. Same for each one of these. Okay, one from the top, one from the side, one from the top, one from the side. I'm gonna clear those, but once you get the hang of it, you'll realize it's pretty straightforward. So this one, capital G, lowercase g, always put the capital letter first. Okay, although I didn't ask you to do this, let's talk about the genotype ratios. So if they have two capital letters, we call that homozygous dominant. If they have one of each, we call that heterozygous. And if we have two lowercase, we call that homozygous recessive. So the way that we organize our ratios is that first we start with homozygous dominant. So there are 0 homozygous dominant. We don't see any capital G's. Then heterozygous, there are actually 4 heterozygous, and there are 0 homozygous recessives. Then phenotypes is the physical representation. So physically, all 4 of these are going to appear green. So it is actually a 4:0 ratio, dominant to recessive. Next we have capital G, lowercase, 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 lowercase. Okay, so the genotype ratio here, starting with, and this is just extra, this is if you're interested in like the advanced portion of the test. The genotype here is going to be, so we always start with homozygous dominant. There's one capital G. So it's homozygous, they're the same, homo means same, and it's dominant, it's capital. So there's one of those. Heterozygous, meaning different, there's 2, capital G, lowercase g's, and there's 1 homozygous recessive. So 2 of the same, but lowercase. Then phenotype. Physical appearance wise, we're just looking at green and yellow. So always start with dominant. So green, there would be 3 green and 1 yellow. The only one that the yellow is going to show up for is the 2 lowercase, the homozygous recessive, and that's because it's not masked by the dominant trait. Okay. Capital S, capital S, capital S, capital S, capital S, lowercase s, capital S, lowercase s. Again, capital letter goes first always. So for these 4 offspring, the genotypes, and if you are interested in learning the genotype phenotype ratio stuff, pause the video now and like try it out with the ones that are left to see if you can come up with it. So genotype, homozygous dominant, there's 2, capital S, capital S. Heterozygous, there's 2, capital S, lowercase s. And homozygous recessive, there are 0. Phenotype, physical appearance, we're looking at round versus square. So there are 1, 2, 3, 4 that are going to have square. So that's that is the dominant trait, and 0 that the recessive trait will show up. All right, for the last one, we're going to have capital S, lowercase s, 2 lowercase, capital S, lowercase s, and 2 lowercase. So for this one, the genotype ratio will be, so there are 0 homozygous dominant, there are 2 heterozygous, and there are 2 homozygous recessive. And the phenotype is 2 will end up square and 2 will end up round. That's it. I hope you enjoyed that.